Okay, I am back and I am going to read you the next section of King George V. So this section is entitled Lloyd George versus Asquith. So I'm going to start reading. The king did not welcome the change, since his early collisions with Asquith over the Parliament bill and Home Rule. He had come to depend on the Prime Minister's calm judgment and reassuring manner. Lloyd George, by contrast, suffered from what Escher called over-elasticity of the mind. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had jolted the Treasury by using figures like adjectives, brought the same restless imagination to the problems of war. It is amusing to see him among our stolid officers, wrote Escher. It is like a fire burning away in the midst of a frozen world. Such ebullience was not to the king's taste. The new premiership, nevertheless, began on an unexpectedly fulsome note. In answer to some advice from the king on how a parliamentary question might best be answered, Lloyd George wrote, I am profoundly impressed by the wisdom and the course suggested by your majesty. The complications of reconstructing the government found Lloyd George no less anxious to please. He deferred to the king's view that Carson would make a more effective First Lord of the Admiralty than Lord Milner, the former African proconsul. Milner instead joined Lloyd George, Curson, Bonar-Law, and Henderson as minister without portfolio in the newly fashioned War Cabinet. Nor was the king dissatisfied with the allocation of the other senior posts. He regretted losing Grey as Foreign Secretary and Crewe as Lord President of the Council. But their successors, Balfour and Curzon, were tried and trusted administrators. Derby took Lloyd George's place at the War Office, hardly an inspiring choice for the new belligerency. Haig was to write of him in a celebrated epigram, a very weak-minded fellow. I am afraid, and like the feather pillow, bears the mark of the last person who has sat to him. But the king had faith in Derby's judgment and knowledge of the army, and at least he could be relieved upon not to ruffle the plumes of the generals. Another measure of the limitations imposed on Lloyd George by his conservative allies was the exclusion from office of Winston Churchill. That, too, the king welcomed in the interests of harmony. Demoted by Asquith after the failure of the Dardanelles, Churchill had remained Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster for only 5 muted months before resigning to command an infantry battalion in France. Yeah, I read about that. Churchill was looking to redeem his status. During World War I, Winston Churchill made some mistakes and was involved in some unfortunate errors, but we now know we think differently of him after World War II. Among the names submitted by the Prime Minister for the lesser office of his government, the king objected only to Sir Alfred Mond, the son of a German Jewish immigrant, as the first Commissioner of Works. He wondered whether Mond's marked guttural accent might not be a handicap at wartime. The Prime Minister assured the king that the future founder of the imperial chemical industries spoke perfect English. Their newfound cordiality was broken by one of Lloyd George's first reforms. He insisted that an efficient cabinet must be served by a secretariat responsibility for daily agenda and minutes. Before his premiership, astonishing though it may seem, no such records were kept. Although the Prime Minister did not send a summary of each day's cabinet business to the sovereign. Although the Prime Minister did send a summary of each day's cabinet business to the sovereign. With the appointment of Maurice Hankey to be the first Secretary of the Cabinet, and the circulation of printed minutes both to its members and to the King, the Prime Minister's letters were discontinued. Not only were they now unnecessary, but Lloyd George detested putting pen to paper. Even when the King and Queen celebrated their silver wedding, he sent them a dictated typewritten letter of congratulations, to which the King punctiliously replied in his own hand. In vain, Hankey observed, "I hate time-honored customs that waste time." The King yearned for a personal flavor of Asquith's letter and was aggrieved at Lloyd George's neglect. As long as the printed cabinet minutes continued to reach the palace regularly, the King had no constitutional grounds for complaint. Increasingly, however, the minutes arrive late or not at all. His Majesty is deeply pained, Stanfordham complained in April 1917, at what he regards as not only a want of respect, but as ignoring his very existence. Such official carelessness could perhaps be attributed to the weightier matters of which occupy the mind of a wartime prime minister, or to the inexperience of Lloyd George's staff, few of whom were drawn from the civil service. Even Asquith had sometimes earned a royal reprimand by failing to meet the King's exacting standards of consultation. But whereas Asquith recognized the need to humor a monarch who could be needlessly loquacious and interfering, Lloyd George displayed a nonchalant a nonchalance not far removed from contempt. Over the years, the King had not troubled to conceal his dislike of Lloyd George. Now the Prime Minister seemed to be taking a spiteful revenge. He left letters unanswered. He ignored a summons to a Privy Council without an explanation or apology. He gleefully admitted to his secretary that he had treated the King abominably, and complained that Balfour had once asked him, "Whatever would you do if you had a ruler with brains?" An acute difference of opinion on the conduct of the war inflamed their mutual dislike. Lloyd George, he was determined to curb Haig's costly and ineffective assaults on the Western Front, to hit the enemy at his weakest points, not his strongest. The King, convinced that the military operations must be left to professional soldiers, deplored such political influence. In 1915, it is true, he had played a part in replacing French by Haig. That, however, was the result of his having lost confidence in an incompetent commander, not in the Western strategy of the General Staff. Like his father and grandmother before him, the King had no doubt that he was at the head of the armed forces in more than name, the guardian of military sentiment and tradition, the protector of senior officers from a too meddlesome ministerial control. Lloyd George would have none of it. He had seized power to win the war, yet found himself as impotent as Asquith. Before he could defeat the Germans, he must first subdue the British army. I had to contend, he wrote, not with the profession, but with a priesthood devoted to its chosen idol. The antagonists seemed ill-matched. Lloyd George's Eastern hearsay was shared only by the rump of the divided Liberal Party. The military high command, Westerners almost to a man, could depend on the support of a Conservative Party, cabinet, and king. For the Conservatives, Lloyd George was a wary respect. By combining with the Asquithian Liberals, they could bring down his coalition whenever they chose. The war cabinet he would charm into reluctant acquiescence. His duty to the king he discharged only when it suited him. A myopic radicalism blinded him to the virtues of a hereditary sovereign whose views he found obstructive. In spite of his attachment to the mystical traditions of Wales, though, as it happened, he was born in Manchester, he found no merit in the most romantic of all English institutions. Other men were proud to serve and die by the hundred thousands in the name of the king. Lloyd George demanded their allegiance to 5 frock-coated politicians round a table in Downing Street. The king put little faith in democracy, least of all when its self-proclaimed champion had become prime minister by intrigue. Yet in defending those generals who clung to a wholly Western strategy, he was not consciously defying constitutional practice. He may nevertheless have been encouraged to do so by Stamfordham, the private secretary who 6 years earlier had rashly advised his master to reject Asquith's demands for contingent guarantees. In December 1916, Stamfordham had asked Haig whether he thought that the king ought to take a more active share in the government of the country. Haig replied that with so doubtful a financial and economic outlook, the king ought on no account to extend his role. Throughout the first of his bitter confrontations with Lloyd George, it was the Prime Minister who acted unconstitutionally by withholding an important decision on the War Cabinet from the king until it was too late for him to make known his views. Lloyd George had every cause for deceit. Not yet strong enough to challenge the general staff on the wisdom of their Western Front strategy, he would try to curb the reckless expenditure of British lives by placing Haig and his armies under the orders of the new and supposedly less obtuse French commander-in-chief, General Nivelle. On the 24th of February, at a war cabinet to which neither Derby nor Robertson had been summoned, the Prime Minister persuaded his colleagues to endorse the plan. 2 days later, at an inter-allied conference in Calais, ostensibly arranged to discuss railway transport, he reached rapid agreement with the French on unity and of command during the forthcoming offensive. Indeed, he was suspected of having already acted in collusion with them behind the backs of his own countrymen. Not until 2 more days had passed did the king receive the minutes of that crucial war cabinet of 24 February, a fait accompli that denied him any voice in so controversial a decision. Furious that the largest British army ever raised should be placed under foreign command, Haig was able to secure some slight modifications of his humiliating sentence. A free hand to choose the means and methods of utilizing the British troops in that sector of operations allotted by the French commander-in-chief. He nevertheless resented the lack of trust shown to him by Lloyd George, and he feared for the future, but he was not without friends. On Haig's appointment as British commander-in-chief, the king had assured him of his constant support and urged him to write freely but secretly whenever he wished. Immediately after the Calais conference, the disgruntled field marshal sent him a long account of Lloyd George's deception. Hinting at his own resignation, he ended his letter. I leave myself in your Majesty's hands to decide what is best for me to do at this juncture. The king was alarmed. Through Stamfordham, he urged Haig on no account to resign. Such a step would never have His Majesty's consent, nor does he believe that it is one entertained for a moment by his government. I am to say from His Majesty that you are not to worry. You may be certain that he will do his utmost to protect your interests. When Haig arrived in London on leave a few days later, it became clear just how little the king would do on Haig's behalf. For neither king nor field marshal could hope to prevail against Lloyd George's popularity as a war leader. Haig described the audience in his diary. The king was most pleased to see me and stated that he would support me through thick and thin. But I must be careful not to resign, because Lloyd George would then appeal to the country for support and would probably come back with a great majority, as LG was at present very popular, it seems. The king's position would then be very difficult. He would be blamed for causing a general election which would cost his country $1 million and stop the munitions work. We went over the whole Calais conference. He was furious with Lloyd George, and he said he was to see him tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to just add in a picture of Lloyd George. Okay. This right here, this is Lloyd George. That's what he looks like. A Liberal politician from Wales, he's known for leading the United Kingdom during the First World War, for social reform policies in his role in the Paris Peace Conference, and for negotiating the establishment of the Irish Free State. So that is what Lloyd George looks like. Lloyd George was duly summoned to the palace. On the whole, an assistant private secretary noted, His Majesty did not consider the interview satisfactory. The king had 2 complaints. He observed, with surprise and pain, that Lloyd George had omitted to send him the minutes of the War Cabinet meeting that preceded the Calais conference, and the arrangement entered into with the French was offensive to national sentiment. The king told the prime minister that if he were an officer serving in the British army and realized he was under the command of a foreign general, he would most strongly resent it, and so would the whole army. If this fact, too, were known in the country, it would be equally condemned. The prime minister said, in the event of such a public expression of feeling, he would go to the country and would explain matters, and very soon have the whole country on his side. In warning Haig not to resign, the king had foreseen that Lloyd George would not hesitate to fight a general election on the issue, employing all the arts of the demagogue to discredit his critics. It was a threat that left the king defenseless. In the circumstances of 1917, Lloyd George was unassailable. As it turned out, his shabby intrigue with the French had been in vain. Nivelle's offensive, to which Lloyd George had sacrificed British military pride, was a disastrous failure as any. By now, however, the Western policy had acquired a momentum of its own. Immune to the protests even of the Prime Minister, at the end of July, Haig launched the most heartbreaking of all campaigns, to which history was given the name Passchendaele. By mid-November, it had claimed 240,000 British casualties without either breaking the enemy front or liberating the Belgian ports, which the German submarines continued to win the war at sea. Far from moving Haig to reconsider his belief in frontal assault, Passchendaele goaded him to try yet again. He found no fault with his plan, only with the inadequacy of the forces at his disposal. As the British army drowned in the Flanders mud, he wrote to the chief of the Imperial General Staff, "One more indispensable condition of decisive success on the Western Front is that the War Cabinet should have a firm faith in the possibility and resolve finally and unreservedly to concentrate our resources on seeking it, and to do so at once. We have need to every man, gun, and airplane that can be provided." It was a familiar refrain. Month after month, Lloyd George had pleaded for an alternative strategy, for the cancellation of Passchendaele in favor of an Italian offensive against Austria. But Robertson and Haig rejected such sideshows out of hand. The Prime Minister longed to replace them by more imaginative advisers, yet dared not dismiss two soldiers whose renown seemed to thrive on failure. Instead, he devised an ingenious variant on the Calais theme. In November 1917, he proposed the establishment at Versailles of a Supreme War Council to coordinate Allied policy, including that of the United States, which had declared war on Germany in April. Sir Henry Wilson, a less enthusiastic Westerner than his fellow generals, was appointed Britain's military representative. 2 months later, Lloyd George went a stage further. He persuaded the French government that there should be an executive committee of the Supreme War Council, having at its disposal an Allied reserve of 30 divisions, together with the power, at least in theory, to instruct both the British and the French commander-in-chief on its deployment. That was Lloyd George's first purpose, to deny Haig the use of British reserves unless sanctioned by Versailles. The second was equally astute. He would rid himself of Robertson by sending him to Versailles, simultaneously recalling Wilson to London as chief of the Imperial General Staff. If, however, Robertson refused the Versailles post, he would be allowed to remain at CIGS, although with reduced power. Lord Beaverbrook, who knew as much of conspiracy as any man alive, wrote admiringly of Lloyd George's design. What a dilemma for Robertson! What a desperate confusion of all his hopes and aspirations! Either way, he was done. For it was apparent that if he stayed on at the War Office, military power would be vested with Sir Henry Wilson at Versailles by reason of his authority over the reserve. If he accepted the Versailles appointment, London would become the center of military authority, where Sir Henry Wilson would fill the role of military advisor to the cabinet. The Prime Minister would, of course, throw his support behind whichever post Robertson rejected. Robertson, as was to be expected, refused both alternatives. He wished to remain at the War Office with undiminished control of military operations. Otherwise, he would retire. It was at this point that the king came to his defense. Robertson was all that he admired, Wilson all that he detested. Robertson had risen from the ranks to be the chief of the Imperial General Staff in a profession where birth and wealth still counted for much. Although he never commanded troops in the field, he became an able quartermaster general of the British Expeditionary Forces, a competent administrator and a sound but unimaginative strategist. He was an impressive personality, Lloyd George wrote of him, with the slowness of speech and the positiveness of statement which gives confidence to the uninitiated. His infrequent utterances had retained the vigor of the barrack room, and that too added to his reputation for sagacity. Leo Amory, however, served with the Cabinet Secretariat, noted in November 1917 that he could not recall a single occasion during the past year on which the SIGs had ventured to forecast either the enemy's plans or our own. Although he harbored a suspicion of foreigners that fell with impartial malevolence on French and German alike, his knowledge of the French language was no worse than the king's. An inter-allied conference he would speak, if correctly, but with an English accent. His discouraging response to the brainwaves of French politicians earned him the nickname of General Non-Non. Wilson was the very antithesis of Robertson, mercurial of mind and lucid in exposition, but the insinuating charm and whimsical humor that captivated his French colleagues at Versailles and found no welcome among his brother's officers, and even Lloyd George, who preferred to cross-examine his advisors rather than wade through their memorandum, condemned Wilson's factitiousness and droll frivolity. It took such forms as referring to politicians as frocks. After their frock coats, and to the commander-in-chief as Sir Haig, the king, who had mistrusted Wilson ever since his collusion with Bonar Law at the time of the Curragh unrest, was infuriated by his flippancy, as when he reported on a sudden advance by the enemy. Sir, the Boche have been very naughty indeed, sir. We must give him a whipping. That was not how the sovereign expected to be addressed. Better Robinson's causative grunts than Wilson's unseemly badinage. I am much worried as the PM is trying to get rid of Robertson, the king wrote in his diary on 13 February 1918. As so frequently happened, Lloyd George had failed to warn the king of the change of SIGs. When reproached by Stamfordham, he replied that he had left the task to Derby, who had apparently forgotten. The removal of the Robertson in favor of Wilson's provoked another sharp tussle between the king and Lloyd George. Stamfordham, ordered to remonstrate with the Prime Minister, wrote of their interview. I told him that the king strongly deprecated the idea of Robertson being removed from the office of Sigs, that his loss in the capacity would be an incalculable one to the army. It would be resented in the country, rejoiced in by the enemy, and I thought would damage the government. And the king considered that Sir William Robertson had enjoyed the absolute confidence of the army, of the officers and the men. The Prime Minister said that he did not share the king's extremely favorable opinion of Sir William Robertson, who had never fought on the front, had hardly ever visited the trenches, and was not known by the rank and file. The Prime Minister said that Robertson had been offered either Paris or to remain in Sigs. He declined either and wished to dictate to everyone. Whereas the Prime Minister repeated that he said on the 22nd of January that Robertson had displayed no capacity as a strategist, and asked that where anyone could be put their finger on the map and say that this or that is due to Robertson's advice. In fact, his forecasts had generally been wrong. Impressed by the Prime Minister's refusal to moderate the terms on which Robertson could continue to be Sigs, Stamfordham spent the next 3 days trying to persuade the stubborn soldiers to accept them, for the sake of the king, the army, and the country. Lloyd George misinterpreted Stamfordham's activities. Before an audience with the king on the 16th of February, he delivered a stern warning as lay in the power of any prime minister. Stamfordham wrote of the confrontation. The king saw the prime minister. Before doing so, Mr. Lloyd George told me that the question of Sir William Robertson had now reached a point that if His Majesty insisted upon him, Sir W.R., remaining in office on the terms he laid down, the government could not carry on, and the king would have to find other ministers. The government must govern, whereas this was practically a military dictation. I assured the Prime Minister that His Majesty had no idea of making any such insistence. That since I saw him, Mr. Lloyd George, on the 13th of February, I had, by the King's instruction, done all in my power to induce Sir William Robertson to remain as a Sig, even though he might consider that the government scheme was so dangerous as even risking our loss of the war. But Sir William Robertson said he could not do so. Therefore, the king regarded the matter as settled, and considered that Sir William Robertson had practically ceased to be a Sig. It was indeed the end of Robertson's reign. Deserted by both Derby and Haig, he resigned as Sigs, and he was appointed to an inferior command of home troops. Wilson succeeded him at the War Office. At one moment during the dispute, the king wrote of Lloyd George, "If he doesn't look out, his government will fall. It is in deep water now." That was a mistaken appreciation. The king had either to accept Robertson's demotion or find a new prime minister, able to command a majority in the Commons. And in February 1918, no such candidate existed. Asquith was too dilatory. Balfour was too detached. Carson was too identified with Northern Ireland to unite the nation. Churchill was discredited by the Dardanelles, Chamberlain by Mesopotamia. Curzon and Milner both lacked popular appeal. And in any case, were immured in the House of Lords. Bonar Law would have been the only acceptable substitute, and he refused to desert the Prime Minister. Lloyd George was as secure as any time during his 6-year premiership. Throughout the remaining months of the war, the king suffered one rebuff after another. He had earlier resisted Lloyd George's recommendations of a peerage for Sir Max Aitken, refusing to accept that his public services called for such a special recognition. Only under the strongest pressure from both the Prime Minister and Bonar Law did the king eventually give his consent. Now Lloyd George, in appointing the recently created Lord Beaverbrook to the Minister of Information, insisted that he should also hold the cabinet office of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. As Stamfordham pointed out, the duchy is the personal property of the sovereign, entailing closer relations between the king and its chancellor than in many of his ministers. Lloyd George replied that Beaverbrook is a first-rate businessman and will administer the duchy well. The king was thus obliged to accept the Canadian adventurer in one of his most historic crown offices. Within a few weeks, Beaverbrook's Daily Express was blaming the king for a visit by the Prince of Wales to the Pope. The king had in fact opposed the visit, but the Foreign Secretary had overruled him. To be attacked so unfairly, and by a newspaper belonging to a member of the government, was a double humiliation, and one without redress. On the 16th of April, 1918, Stamfordham was instructed to make two quite separate protests to Lloyd George. The first was against the removal of Sir Hugh Trenchard, the virtual creator of the Royal Air Force, from the post of Chief of Air Staff, the second against the replacement of Lord Bertie, the British ambassador in Paris, by Lord Derby. In neither instance had the Prime Minister followed the customary practice of consulting the king, who learned of Trenchard's dismissal from the newspapers and of Bertie's fate by telephone. Shortly before the news was made public, a Downing Street secretary apologized for the discourtesy, explaining that the Prime Minister had been working a 21-hour day at a time. It was a plausible excuse. The changes in London and Paris had coincided with a last desperate attempt by Germany to breach the Allied lines in the Western Front, an assault so nearly successful as to evoke Haig's famous order of the day. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight to the very end. Stamfordham had not chosen the best moments for his pained protest. Lloyd George was so impenitent about the changes themselves. He told Hankey that he had got very angry and sent Stamfordham away with a flea in his ear, telling him that the king was encouraging mutiny by taking up a cause of these efforts of these officers, Trenchard and Robertson, whom the government had decided to get rid of. Nor was the king able to prevent the enforced retirement of Bertie or his replacement. by Derby, whom Lloyd George wanted to remove from the War Office. Although Derby was an old friend, the king doubted, wrongly as it happened, whether he possessed the necessary skills for so sensitive a diplomatic post as Paris. Bertie was, by contrast, had built up an impregnable reputation during 13 years before. Robert Vansittart, who served under him as a young man, wrote, "Once or twice a week he would tug his white mustache, cock his high hat, immensely high with a narrow ribbon at the base, and strut into Quai d'Orsay, where he would speak his mind to the transit minister in a fashion no longer heard. He made one feel that the finest thing in the world was to be His Britannic Majesty's ambassador in Paris." Although Bertie spoke French fluently, it was with an English accent. When asked why, he would reply, okay, I am not even going to try to pronounce that. His descents on the chancery of his own embassy were also memorable. One morning he greeted a particularly mild peer with the inquiry, "Well, my lord, did you leave her half dead?" and asked another member of his staff who was suffering from a cold whether he had slept with a damp woman. The king's pre-war misgivings about a diplomatist so wedded to the Republican French gave way to the admiration. In 1917, prompted by Jules Canbon, the equally remarkable French ambassador in London, he successfully urged the government not to replace the robust, experienced, and well-informed Bertie by a more politically minded envoy. A year later, however, Bertie was abruptly superseded by Derby. The king could neither save him nor soften the blow by creating him an earl. Lloyd George insisted that Bertie's services deserved no more than a single step in the peerage, from baron to viscount. Even on such a trivial issue, the king could not prevail over his graceless prime minister. Only once throughout 4 years of war did the king persuade Lloyd George to change course on an important matter of policy. It proved in retrospect to be the most perplexing act of his reign, and the abandonment of a loyal ally and much-loved cousin to degradation and death. Okay. We're going on to the next subject, which is defending the generals. And I'm going to cover this in a separate episode for Chapter 6 because this is quite long. And but I'll go ahead and get started and see if we can last, if my voice can last. So, but yeah, I think I'll just go ahead and cover this in a separate episode. We're in a separate episode which will be called Defending the Generals. And this is during the chapter The Great War. So I'll take a break and come back in about 15 minutes on a separate episode.